Good evening, everyone, and welcome back to the Natural Gas Engineering internship at Petro. I hope all of you good and safe. My name is Rahima Babayeva, and I'm a fresh graduate from the University of Aberdeen. I have finished my Master of Science in Petroleum Engineering, and I'm going to be your moderator for today's session on behalf of Arab Oil and Gas Academy. Today's webinar is going to be about rate transient analysis given by James Ewert. He's a technical expert and instructor of rate transient analysis for IHS Markit. James Ewert has led numerous courses in both Canada and the United States for a range of clients from major producers to consulting firms. James has become most well known for his research and workflow development in analyzing high water cut Permian wells using multi-phase methods. He joined the company as part of the 2013 acquisition of Piketty Associates. Previously, he served as an oil and gas operations officer for the Yukon territorial government, ensuring fulfillment of facility and reservoir engineering functions mandated by the Yukon Oil and Gas Act. James earned his bachelor degree in engineering from Carleton University, Canada, and his master degrees in engineering from the Harold Vance Department of Petroleum Engineering at Texas and A&M, United States. Now, before starting today's session, I would like to mention that you can ask your question from QA part, and 3 or 5 questions will be answered by Mr. Ewert. Let's welcome Mr. James Ewert. Mr. Ewert, we are very delighted to be here today.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for taking your time to be here with me. I thought a lot about how to go through all of the material I want to go through today. Taking rate transient analysis and putting it into about an hour to give it justice, to do it justice, really means that I'm going to try to cover a lot of material. Now, sometimes it takes me a little bit longer than an hour. Sometimes, depending on how much coffee I've had, sometimes I can get a little bit faster. But what I really would like for all of you to take away from this are some of the key points from rate transient analysis, why it's important, what it can do for you, and just the basics from it. So I don't think you're going to walk away from this hour being ready to go and analyze some wells, but I think this is a great foundation for folks who might be new to this part of the industry and haven't really been exposed to it very much before. So if this is my rate transient analysis theory presentation, and like I said, we're going to try to do it in the hour. Now, thank you very much for the introduction. I won't spend too much time on my background. What I would like to say to you is that anything that I say, if you find anything I say valuable, it's because other people in industry have taken the time to share their insights with me. We work in a great industry where people are very generous with their time. They're very generous with sharing knowledge. And when people are there to work with you, I encourage you to listen as much as possible when those opportunities arise, because you never know who's going to say something that was really going to help you with your work in the future. Now, I'm not saying this presentation is necessarily going to be one of those times. Of course, I hope it kind of is. But sometimes people tend to listen more to the biggest names for insights, where I have to say some of the small conversations I have at the different conferences and workshops, people will say things that have completely changed how I look at data. And this is what I do all day, every day. And so when you get used to it, when you start getting into a mode, you can get a little bit of tunnel vision. And when you get an outside perspective, it can really bring a lot more color to what you're trying to accomplish. So I just encourage you through your careers to keep an open mind and talk to people and really listen to the challenges they've had. It might help you out quite a bit. The other thing I'll say is for those of you that have been keeping up with the news in Texas, the power has been kind of going on and off, so has the internet. I think we're going to be okay, but if my internet does go down, I'm going to switch over to my cell phone internet, so there might be a little bit of an interruption. And I also have 3 kids on the other side of this wall, and so if you hear noises or crying, it's not me. I'm not the one crying, so I just wanted to be clear on that. So before we jump into rate transient analysis specifically, I want to give more of a broad view. I want to take a step back and I want to talk about production data analysis as a whole. Now, production data analysis is the science and art of extracting useful information about the reservoir. How big is the reservoir? The completion. I tend to speak more about unconventional, so forgive me for that. I like to think in terms of horizontal wellbore lengths, fracture sizes, things of that nature, or surface operations based on interpretation, analysis, and modeling of continuous measurements of production volumes and flowing pressures. So as engineers, we like the science part. As engineers, we don't like the art part. Now, where the art comes in is when we have a lot of different graphs or charts, and we're looking at those trying to analyze if we see a straight line or if we see a curvature or things of that nature. The art is why in some cases you'll get variability in results. If you were to analyze a well and I was to analyze a well and we went through similar methods, we should get similarly to the same conclusion, but there are variances in analysis that we expect when different engineers are analyzing data. Now, why do we do production data analysis? Why is it important? It helps us optimize our completions. If you can take your data and understand it, you can start to compare wells with each other. And you can say, well, these wells did quite well. These wells over here, they didn't do very well. I wonder why. And you can dig down and you can see whether it was the type of completion that was done. Maybe it's the company. All of these different things can be considered, because the more you do the great things more and the bad things less, you're going to save a lot of money and be more profitable. Oftentimes with production data analysis, we want to characterize our reservoir properties in terms of permeability, fracture properties, connected pore volume. We want to evaluate our reserves and forecast production. We want to provide scientific support for reserves auditors. And we want to select the best candidates for production optimization. If there's a well that isn't doing as well as it could be, and we could just make a smaller investment and reap the rewards of more EUR, we want to identify those, because that again is going to make us more profitable in the end. So there are three, some could argue there's a couple more, but there's three main portions of production data analysis I want to concentrate on today. And rate transient analysis fits beautifully where pressure transient analysis used to stand relatively alone and decline analysis stood relatively alone. There's overlap here that I really want you to see. Rate transient analysis is going to help us get that OIP and that OGIP that typically we would get from that pressure transient analysis. And the decline analysis helps us get an EUR. Rate transient analysis is going to help us to get an EUR as well. The difference is rate transient analysis is going to allow us to get a physics-based forecast, a physics-based EUR. So decline curve analysis is still, to this day, very, very, very popular. In fact, in talking about B parameters and D limbs and all the rest of it, this is the language that as reservoir engineers we use to talk to other industries. When we're talking to the financial district, if we're looking for investment, if we're talking to government agencies who are looking to see what we're going to book in terms of reserves, the language that we all speak is B parameters and just ARB's decline jargon overall. So of course, decline curve analysis has been along for a long time. It only needs production rates. It does not need pressures. It also assumes that you are in boundary dominated flow. And essentially what we're trying to do is say, if we have some historical data, we can draw a line through that and estimate what's going to happen in the future to get an overall EUR. Now, the best decline analysis I've ever seen projects are ones where they've taken decline analyses for individual wells, but they've looked at everything at a group level as well. Because what you can start to do is use what we call analogy to say, well, if these wells are similar to this one and they acted in this way over the past couple of years, we would expect this one to be very similar to that. And so you can start to take learnings from previous longer producing wells and apply them to newer wells and get a sense of what you think they're going to produce over their lifetime. So the advantages of decline curve analysis, it is easy and convenient. You do not need a whole lot of information to start putting decline curves through your data. You don't need to know PVT information. You don't need to know what the reservoir pressure is, anything like that. Now, if you can capture, if you can get a sense of what that reservoir signal is going to do moving forward, you can get a real indication of well performance, particularly if your well truly is in boundary dominated flow. But there's a trade-off here, right? If something's simple, there tends to be a trade-off. And the trade-off in this case is you have to assume that your well is going to be at its constant operating conditions. And let me give you an example. If you have a gas well and it's flowing up casing, and let's say water's starting to become a bit of an issue, so you install tubing, what you're going to see in your production is you're going to see an uplift in production. So you're going to have the data from before, and then some uplift, and then another decline. Decline analysis doesn't know that's going to happen. It has no clue. So it would just draw a line through that original portion of the data without being able to take into account the uplift from that operational change that you made. The decline analysis provides you very limited information about the reservoir. It can't really tell you too much about what's going on, and it is very non-unique, particularly for lower permeability plays. So here's some gas data from a low permeability play, probably about half a micro Darcy in matrix perm, and you could put a forecast through that looks something like this. Now, I tend to be pessimistic by nature, so this is probably the line that I would put through the data. I'd place it through, I'd say, okay, I think this is where my line's going to go, so this is what my EUR is. Now, if you're more optimistic than I am, if you have a little bit more sunshine in your step, you might do something like this. But look at how it's matching that historical data. It looks fine. It's very difficult to argue with that match. Now, someone else could come along that's even more optimistic, even more full of sunshine, and they could place a line like this. Now, if we have no other information, if we have nothing else to go off of, if we have no other historical production from wells around it, or anyone working with us who has experience in rock types like the one we're working in, I would say that all of these forecasts are equally valid. But where they terminate on the x-axis, those EUR differences have real consequences. That EUR gets converted into money, and that is a big decision maker and a big drive as to whether we're going to drill more wells here, how we're going to produce this well, etc. So it's easy to do, but the non-uniqueness can be quite an issue. Now, with pressure transient analysis, I'm going to touch on this one very quickly because the points that I'd like to make on pressure transient analysis tend to be, I would say, more, I don't know if I want to say more valid, but they pertain more to plays with lower and lower permeability. So let me frame this a slightly different way. As we were getting into lower permeability plays, very typically what we would do with the standard wells that were in a boundary dominated flow is you shut in your well, you get it up to average reservoir pressure, you can kind of figure out material balance wise what fluid was in place and what you think you're going to get out of it. Now, that was great when we had Darcy plays and millidarcy plays, but as we started to get down to micro Darcies, shutting in those wells and waiting for the pressure to build up to average reservoir pressure was taking a long time. So you can imagine that when we start to get to plays like the Permian, where we're down into the nano Darcies, you could shut in that well and wait for it to reach your average reservoir pressure to do your calculation. That would be your entire career, right? You could shut it in, wait for it, log it, and I don't even know if then you would still be at your average reservoir pressure, and that would give you an indication of what's going on. So we clearly had an issue with unconventional wells, particularly because we had such long transients. We weren't in that boundary dominated flow. So we need to find a way to get a sense of our contacted volume, our material balance, without shutting in those wells. So of course, PTA, pressure transient analysis, you get that excellent data quality. You can do very detailed analysis. The better the data, the clearer the signal that you're going to get from it. But a lot of the tests that we're going to do there, they require buildups. And when you build up a well, even if it's a higher perm, you have to shut it in. That well's not making money. If it's shut in, it's not making money, so it costs money. And so with the lower permeability plays, that buildup time to the average reservoir pressure was starting to take far too long. So this is where rate transient analysis started to become more popular. Now, different people would give it different timescales. I'm going to say about 2006. That's where we started to see more people looking for ways of getting a sense of what their contacted volumes were, their material balance was, without having to shut in the wells and without having to wait a very long time. So rate transient analysis is a combined rate pressure technique. So just like pressure transient analysis, rate transient analysis needs pressures and rates. Remember, decline analysis only needed volumes, it only needed rates. So RTA, rate transient analysis, needs rates and pressures, and it can test for the productivity of a single well or a description of a reservoir. Now, my friends in PTA are very quick to remind me, and they're not wrong, that in theory, RTA and PTA are I have on the slide that they're identical. Of course, there's some differences, but they're slightly different ways at looking very similar data. So RTA uses daily data, where PTA has higher resolution than that. So it's a lower cost alternative. And the reason companies really like rate transient analysis is it's going to give you insights into your reservoir, insights into your well, using data you're collecting anyway. If you're collecting pressures, if you're collecting rates, you're doing that when you're producing the well anyway. So you're getting that data, let's say for free, right? So you're getting it, and now we can do a lot of great work with that to understand what's going on and better estimate what's going to happen in the future. So with PTA, RTA, I think that connection's pretty clear. With decline analysis, I want to make this point once again. Decline analysis is going to give you an empirical curve, a line fit through just the rate data. RTA is going to give you a physics-based forecast. We're going to use a physics-based model. It's going to take into account operational changes and all the different things that can happen in complex systems in order to get you a more correct EUR. You care about that because the more you can trust your forecast, the more you can trust the volume you're going to get from a well, the better decisions you're going to make for your company moving forward. So here, very quick, here's the overlay once again. The big deal, PTA, RTA, no shut-ins required to get your material balance, to get a sense of your contacted volume. With decline analysis in RTA, we're going to get a forecast as well. We're going to get that EUR, but it's going to be based on a physics-based forecast. It's going to be informed by our PVT. It's going to be informed with our initial pressure. It's going to be informed with our completion and our reservoir. It's not going to just be a line curve. It's going to be a physics-based line curve. Okay, now this next section is one that I debate whether to keep in or keep out, because you're always at risk of offending people when you try to condense an industry into just a few slides as to who's contributed towards what's to that industry. And so really, for me to do a total history of RTA, I believe that would be a 2-day course, maybe a 3-day course. So what I've put together here is just a few of the folks whose work has been very instrumental in primarily unconventional plays. As I said, that's very much my day-to-day focus. International and conventional tends to be more project-based. The reason I thought that this might still be valuable to share with all of you is because I'm commonly asked for some papers that I would recommend people read to kind of get started with RTA. So what you're going to notice here in the slide deck is that there's going to be SPE number references for a number of the authors I'm going to touch on. This is not an exhaustive list. This is not a Hall of Fame by any stretch of the imagination. There's so many people we could talk about, and there's a lot of contributions internationally that folks have made. This is a small window of what I have been experienced to with the unconventionals in North America. So I thought it was still valuable to touch on it, just in case you were interested after this talk in kind of digging deeper into some SPE papers. So first and foremost, I think whenever we're talking about reservoir engineering, conventional, unconventional, doesn't matter. We need to pause and think about Mr. Morris Muscat, who wrote the physical principles of oil production. He is the reason we have the work done on steady state fluid flow and unsteady state fluid flow and mass balance. A lot of the work that is just everything else is based on really comes down to Morris Muscat. And so if you haven't heard of him before, it's my great pleasure to bring up his name to you for the first time. Mr. J.J. Arps, a lot of people, of course, have heard of this before. I touched on it just a few slides ago. If you are interested in reading about his work, there are various resources. The one that I find the most helpful is SPE 945228G. This is where he develops his empirical equations, but he also gives a great history of the other work that was done up to that point. So it kind of reads like a historical document, and then he has his ideas in it. It's a fantastic read. I try to go through it about at least once a year. Now I'm just going to name people off because, as I said, there's so many that we could touch on. We have Everding and Hurst, who did the practical analytical solution for well testing. Horner with the analysis of pressure buildup data. Park Jones with the reservoir limit test. Karlsla and Jaeger with the partial differential equations derived for fluid flow. Al Husseini and Ramey, who did the pseudo pressure for gas wells. Gentry, where he converts ARPS declines into log-log format. Bourdet, who used the pressure derivative and well test interpretation. I mean, I am not giving proper credit to any of these folks, and I would encourage you to look up their work as well. Michael Fekovich, great man. SPE 4626PA is a great read if you were interested. He created the first type curve that encapsulates the full life of a well. Now, if you're not clear on what a type curve is, different people use different words. In rate transient analysis, what we can do using dimensionless variables is we can take data from your well, from any well, and put it on some curves and place that data on those curves. And what that's going to tell us is the permeability and skin of your system and the total contacted volume, depending how much data you have to analyze. But it allows us to get insights from a productivity and a volume, contacted volume perspective of your data all in one plot. So if you have any data, let's say in radial flow from around the world, you can put it on the same plot and get a sense of what's going on from it. It was such a huge step forward. And Louis Matar, who some of you might recognize the name, he was very influential at Fouquet Associates for particularly for gas. He showed me the old papers that they used to use before they used computers for it, before Harmony was there and other programs were there, where they would match the data on the type curves by hand. It was a really an amazing thing. So Michael Fekovich, if you're interested in the fundamentals, the beginnings of RTA, I highly recommend reading up on him. Dr. Tom Blasingame, I presume many of you have heard his name before. There's so many papers I could associate with him. I boiled it down to two because it's supposed to be a brief history, of course. I would say SPE 21513, SPE 15028, just absolutely phenomenal. He developed material balance time, which is such a major component of how we understand the data, how we try to listen to what the data is trying to tell us. It's been quoted from various folks that Dr. Blasingame deserves the full credit of rate transient analysis as we know it today. So very fundamental figure in what we do. Now, Mr. Robert Wattenberger, SPE 39931. This might be more for the folks for unconventionals, or if you're going to be dealing with any wells with linear flow, this would be an interesting paper for you to read. This is where we talk about the square root time plots, trying to get a sense of linear flow. For those of you that might not be aware, here, when we're dealing with the unconventional wells, people really want to analyze linear flow because it gives them an indication of how big their stimulated region is. And when people are spending a lot of money fracturing their wells and doing massive completions, they want to know that their completion was huge and that they're getting a lot of productivity from it. So Mr. Rottenberger's work is used for that, to get a sense of how big they are, how big the completions are, but also how productive they are. So this is a plot that we use in unconventionals in every analysis that we do. Very fundamental and instrumental work. Also, we have the flowing material balance, which is the worksheet that we use to get our original volumes in place without the need for that average reservoir pressure. I'll be touching on that equation in just a moment. But we have Louis Matar at the top left, Ralph McNeil, and Hamed Tabatabi at the bottom right. Also, Chris Clarkson have all worked towards getting a material balance plot that uses flowing pressures and rates in order to get a sense of your contacted volume without having to shut in the well. And what we're just getting into now as an industry is looking at that from a multi-phase perspective. Things have been a single phase for quite a while. A single phase gas can still get really tricky. But overall, if you have a gas condensate system or an oil below the bubble point or water issues, all of these things, we're starting to incorporate all that into the interpretation. So as I said, that is a very brief history. I hope you noted some of those papers down for future reference because they really are a great read if this is an interest area for you moving forward. So let's do a quick introduction to rate transient analysis theory. This is super important. There's a lot of terms that people use, and people will say all sorts of things. And I'll have to say to you that I'm Canadian. I live in Houston now. I still don't quite understand football the way that my great American friends talk about it. And so when anyone talks about football, I just nod my head, right? And if anyone smiles, that's when I smile. And if anyone laughs, that's when I laugh. But I have no idea what we're talking about. And I have to say to you that even after going through school, after doing well in school, when I went to Markit and I stood around a bunch of engineers who had been doing this for years, they were all talking to each other and they were saying things like reservoir signal and this and that. I, embarrassingly enough, was sitting there nodding just like I do when it was talking about football and kind of going, oh yes, and agreeing with whoever the smartest person in the room was saying something, I would just automatically agree with them. It's because what I learned in the book was different than knowing something internally. So there is knowing and there's realizing. And so what I'm hoping to do with this slide is to make it very clear to you the words that I am using when I'm talking about reservoir signal, because it is fundamental to everything else that we're talking about. I want you to know that if you hold your pressure constant, now this pressure, please note the pressure I'm talking about is your bottom hole pressure. I'm talking about the pressure at the down hole. PWF, wellbore flowing pressure. If you can keep that pressure constant for a short amount of time, you will find that your rate will go from one rate down to another, right? So it's going to step down and it's going to have a curvature to its line. What I want you to know is that first point to the next point and how that line curves, that contains all of the information of your completion and your reservoir right there. That can tell you what your contacted volume is. That can tell you what your minimum fracture half length is, how big your investigated stimulated region is, how big your radius of investigation is. All of these things is captured right here. That is what we call the reservoir signal. So when I say to you reservoir signal, this is what I'm talking about. Now, it's true on the constant pressure side, but it's also true on the constant rate side. So if we keep that rate constant, just for a short amount of time, not a lot of time, the pressure, the bottom hole pressure will conversely go from one point down to another, and it will have a curvature to its line, and it will contain that same information. So keep in mind, when I'm saying reservoir signal, I'm talking about the rate and the pressure together. Okay, it gives us a full picture of what's going on. Sometimes when I think about reservoir signal and I think about rates and pressures, I try to think of it in terms of what people talk about when they're talking about outer space. And this might sound weird, but space-time, right? If we were all going to meet for a cup of tea somewhere, we could choose the location of where we're going to go get tea, and that's great. But if we don't say the time, then that doesn't work for us because we're only getting half the story. If you told me, hey, let's go for some tea at 9 o'clock, but you don't tell me where, once again, you've only given me half the story, and there's only so much I can do with it. And that's why decline analysis, as we've talked about it, is so limited because in many cases, you're just getting half the story. So the reservoir signal is the time and the place. It brings everything together. It's a context for each other for us to understand what's going on. This is the building block for everything we do in rate transient analysis, the reservoir signal. Okay. So now we're going to go, I'm only going to cover, I think it's one equation. There might be another one tossed in. I want you to know about the fundamental equation of rate transient analysis. There is an equation that is used. It is called the pseudo-steady state inflow equation. It is an equation where we're going to take Darcy's law and we're going to take compressibility and we're going to put it together. And what you're going to see is that the term for average reservoir pressure gets factored out. So what I really want you to get from this is that with pressure transient analysis, we need to shut in the well and build it up to average reservoir pressure. In that case, we're talking about P bar minus PWF, average reservoir pressure minus wellbore flowing pressure. What we're going to do is we're going to factor out average reservoir pressure, and we're going to start to think about our reservoir in terms of initial pressure and wellbore flowing pressure. Initial pressure is the pressure in the reservoir as it was before we did anything down there, right? So initial pressure, wellbore flowing pressure. If we get the difference between that, we can start to understand that delta P gives us the context for all of the flow that we're going to get. So I'm going to show you that here. So the pseudo-steady state inflow equation is the fundamental equation for rate transient analysis. When it was originally solved, you always want to start simple and then make it more complicated after. It was originally solved for a single phase oil above the bubble point, because then we can assume a constant compressibility. We can assume a constant density or viscosity. Now, gas systems are more complex, and I'll touch on that a few slides later. We take the solutions that we develop for oil, and then what we do is we apply a pseudo pressure and a pseudo time to the gas data in order to make these methods work with that gas data. Because remember, gas, the compressibility, the viscosity, it's so volatile. And so what we need to do is to control it, make it sensical in a fashion so that it works with these original tools that were developed for a single phase oil above the bubble point. Now, the other thing I want you to know is that when we are going through these equations, they were developed for constant rate systems. Okay, when we're talking about variable rate, and we'll touch on this as well, for that, we would require superposition. And so we'll touch on that very soon. So I want you to know that there's two components of the pseudo-steady state equation. There is inflow, which is Darcy's law. Remember, I told you how the shape of that curve of rate or the shape of that curve of pressure is meaningful? Darcy's law. That the curvature, that's why it's so important. That's what it's describing for us. The second part that's super important to us is the depletion, right? If you have a system that's going to empty through time, it's going to deplete. If you just had an inflow and it stayed there forever, that would be a steady state system. This is a pseudo-steady state system. So we have that inflow and it's going to deplete through time. When we bring those together, you will get the pseudo-steady state equation. So please note how everything here is in terms of P bar, which is that average reservoir pressure, the pressure we would need to shut in the well and let the pressure build up till we got it, right? We don't want to do that anymore. So we can put the inflow in terms of P bar. We can put the depletion in terms of P bar. We can make those two equations equal to each other, and that's how we get the pseudo-steady state equation. Now, the reason we're using constant rate is because something really interesting happens with constant rate data that it doesn't at constant wellbore flowing pressure. I really wish I knew where this image came from because I refer to it quite often. On the left-hand side, they both kind of look like fireworks, but on the left-hand side, notice how you're depleting your well, how it kind of opens up like a flower, right? So your pressure is always staying at the same part, but you're going through your transient, and as soon as you hit your boundary, it's just going to keep opening up like this. Look at the constant rate system. The constant rate system appears to be more uniform. It appears to be more structured. And so let me describe to you what's going on there. In the constant rate system, instead of a flower opening up, we have the same curve, but it's going down in time. And so that pressure is going down, down, down. What I want you to know is that for a constant rate system with an oil above the bubble point, if you have bounded flow, boundary dominated flow, the change in pressure, the pressure change at the wellbore flowing pressure from here to here is going to be exactly the same at the reservoir extent. So what I'm telling you is we can look at what's happening at the wellbore and know how much the pressure dropped in our entire tank. And that is part of the reason this whole thing works. If we know how much pressure is dropped out here, our equations are going to make a lot of sense. So we're anchoring off the fact that in constant rate systems, the change in pressure at our wellbore in bounded flow is going to equal the change in pressure at our reservoir extent. So let's look at this slightly differently. I have my wellbore on the left-hand side. This is my reservoir boundary on the right-hand side. This is distance, and we're going to draw some pressure. So we have our wellbore flowing pressure. And there's our pressure. It's low here, but of course it's going to build up till we get to the reservoir extent, and then you can calculate kind of an average reservoir pressure there. This is going to be described by Darcy's law. All we do is we take Darcy's law, we rearrange it, we do a substitution, we call BPSS, B pseudo-steady state, we just do a substitution. What you need to know about BPSS is it's the inverse of the productivity index, if you're interested. That's the meaning of it. And what we're left with is that equation that I showed you on the slide previous. So it's Darcy's law, rearrange, substitution, you have that equation. Now, over time, what's going to happen? Well, what's going to happen is that the curve is going to stay the same, but it's going to go down. And so through time, you're going to notice that we're depleting the reservoir. So we have the curvature, that's Darcy's law. Now we need to talk about depletion. How are we going to talk about that? We're going to describe that through the compressibility equation. So as the pseudo-steady state well depletes and it's in boundary dominated flow, the depletion or the material balance of the oil above the bubble point can be characterized by the total compressibility of the system, assuming it's constant. So notice how I have my initial volume, it's totally full. And when it's totally full, my pressure is that initial pressure. Okay, PI, initial pressure. After some time, I've taken some oil out. How much oil? I've taken NP out. So what's left is N minus NP, just the difference between the two. But notice that when we take that oil out of that tank, our pressure has to change. It has to agree in terms of reservoir signal. It has to agree in terms of material balance. And so we change the pressure by delta P. So it was at PI, we changed it by delta P. So what's the new pressure? Well, it's PI minus delta P. That's the difference. And so we can keep depleting and keep depleting through time. So what we do is we take that compressibility equation, we just rearrange it again, very simple. Then we do that substitution and you're left with the equation as I presented to you a few slides ago. So once again, we're going to take the inflow, we're going to take the depletion, we put it in terms of average reservoir pressure because we don't want to shut in our wells anymore. Rate transient analysis wants to get all of this information from flowing data. We don't want to shut it in and get a sense of it. And so we bring these portions of the equations together. They come together, we rearrange it, and we're left with a flowing material balance equation for constant rate and for variable rate. So all of that comes together. There's no average reservoir pressure. And the big thing for you to remember today is that when you're talking about rate transient analysis, if anyone ever says delta P to you, a difference in pressure, they are talking about the initial pressure and the wellbore flowing pressure. They are not referring to average reservoir pressure generally. Okay, so once again, we're trying to squeeze a lot into a short amount of time. The fundamental equation is just super important. You factor out average reservoir pressure and everything's in terms of initial pressure and wellbore flowing pressure. That's really the big takeaway. If you remember that, I'm super happy. I mentioned a moment ago that constant rate, when we're dealing with equations and equation development, constant rate is a great place to start because it's so well behaved. We have some synergies there that seem to work very well together. When you're analyzing variable rate data with rate transient analysis, you require something called superposition. And so I want to touch on that so you're aware of it, so that if you are interested in learning more about rate transient analysis, when you see it, you know of it. And it's clear what it's doing for us to help us get a better idea of analyzing our wells. So superposition. Keep in mind, the initial equations for rate transient analysis were derived for constant rate systems. So in order to analyze variable rate and variable pressure data, we need to convert it to an equivalent constant rate solution. So we're not changing the equations a whole lot. What we're going to do is change the data so that it fits with those equations that we have. So superposition time converts a multiple rate history or variable rate history into a series of constant rate periods. And we just add them and subtract them from themselves. And if you do that, you can recreate something that's more complex. So keep in mind, if you have a very complex system, you can approximate it by superposing something simpler. So let me give you an example. If I take a Lego brick, if I take a very simple child's toy and look at it and consider that to be like the reservoir signal, it is small, it is finite, It is self-contained. It's easy to understand. If I start playing around with that brick and I get maybe 10,000 more, you can start to build things that are absolutely incredible. So this was a Statue of Liberty. This isn't exactly the same one that I saw, but there was a number of different statues that I've seen in various places around North America where people have built amazingly complex statues by taking a small block and superposing it on top of each other. Right? So if we assume that the block sizes are all the same here and we smash this thing to the ground, what's going to happen is it's going to go out in a bunch of individual simple pieces. This is complex. We can build complexity by stacking or superposing simplicity. And so when we're doing superposition time, when we're taking that reservoir signal and adding and subtracting it to build something complex, it's the same as taking those blocks and adding them together and removing them to create something that's more complex. It's all about that simple piece. And let me tell you, the more correct you are about your reservoir signal, the better your entire statue is going to be, right? Because if you misinterpret your reservoir signal, your entire statue, the entire complex piece that you're building is going to be way off. And that's why it's so important to understand it at that fundamental level. So let's do a quick example of superposition. It's a quick illustration of it. So the superposition principle for all linear systems, the net response caused by two or more stimuli is the sum of the responses that would have been caused by each stimulus individually. That's a lot of words. Let's just go through it. If I have a rate, right, and this is my pressure, notice that that's reservoir signal, right? Constant rate, my pressure dipping down. So that's my reservoir signal. If I needed to increase my rate, what I could do is stack the rate on top, and then I need to figure out what's my pressure response going to be. All I need to do is to subtract from where the pressure was going to be with what I'm expecting it to do. So here's the rate, and it was going to keep going on. I added another rate to it. And from that, I know to subtract this from this. And from that, that's our building block where we're going to add and subtract to build those really complex histories. I want you to know that there are different types of superposition time. There is a superposition time developed specifically for radial flow. There is one specifically for linear flow. There is one for bilinear flow, and there's also one for boundary-dominated flow. What I want you to know is that the boundary-dominated flow superposition time is the one that most people hear about or use or talk about. It is called material balance time. So let me say that a different way. Material balance time is superposition for boundary-dominated flow. Okay, material balance time is superposition for the flow regime of boundary-dominated flow. All right, we're going through. We're doing a full day course, and we're cruising through. I do want you to know, because I know the focus here is a lot on gas, that I wanted to touch on the corrections for gas reservoirs in case it was helpful. Gas reservoirs can be tricky. We typically use multi-phase models even for single-phase gas wells when we analyze them for clients, because there's some issues which can arise, which I'll touch on in a moment. So doing single-phase models for gas wells, if there's low permeability, or if there's a lot of stimulation, a lot of fractures, there's some weirdness that can kind of occur. I'll touch on that and just give you a sense of what that might look like. So first and foremost, when we're dealing with those original equations that we talked about for rate transient analysis, if we want to deal with gas, I always think when I'm analyzing a well, I think of oil as the parent, because oil is very usually calm, it's slow moving, right? It does what it wants. It just kind of does its thing. Gas is volatile. So gas to me is the kid. And if you look at data, if you get the chance to see real data, you'll notice very often gas will kind of go crazy for different reasons. Gas is so susceptible to any change that occurs, right? If you start to change a choke a little bit, the oil will just kind of slowly move with it. It's not a big deal. Gas just kind of wants to freak out a little bit and see what's going on. So gas is very expressive because it's so energetic, because it's so compressible. So in order to harness the excitement gas has, the volatility of gas, we need to use the corrections, right? So the big thing here is that gas properties vary very much with pressure. The formation volume factor is going to change. The compressibility is really going to change. And the viscosity is also going to change. So what we need to do is we need to use something to try to harness the gas from each perspective. The first one that we're going to talk about is pseudo pressure. So Darcy's law states that for a given porous medium of set area length permeability and a fluid with a given viscosity, that there's a proportional relationship between a rate change and a pressure drop. Right? So if you change the rate, your pressure changes and vice versa. And for oil above the bubble point, that's true. For water, that's super true. For gas, it starts to get a little crazier. And that's because the viscosity and the Z factor vary so much with pressure. And so there's a correction that we use that's called pseudo pressure. Pseudo pressure is what is used to help the gas to operate or be useful, to convert it in a way where the RTA equations can apply to it. So it's a correction for gas, pseudo pressure. So here's an image of the compressibility of gas. Notice how much it changes. Pressure's on the x-axis, if you can't see that too clearly. My compressibility is on the y-axis. Just at the very tip here, as we go from 5,000 to about 4,500 psi, not a big difference. It's changing, but I mean, no big difference. Notice once you get into that bend, like even here, look at the difference between 1,000 and 500. It is so volatile. It changes so much. It's so important to take that into account. And so pseudo pressure is half of it. The other half is pseudo-time. So pseudo-time is a mathematical time function, and it's going to account for the total compressibility and viscosity of the gas as the variable porosity with respect to time and pressure. So in order for this to work, this is where everything I've said up to this point is true, but there's a little wrinkle when it comes to gas. And this is why single phase modeling and multi-phase modeling, or I'm going to say analytical and numerical, if I may, this is why one is clearly better than the other. We have just talked now for 20 or so minutes about average reservoir pressure, getting rid of it. RTA cares about initial pressure, wellbore flowing pressure. We're having a great time. When it comes to gas, when we're trying to estimate what the compressibility is doing at a certain time, or what viscosity is doing at a certain time, what we need is we need to estimate that at an average reservoir pressure. If you are modeling your wells using an analytical model, a single phase model, the model is going to try to guess or calculate what the average reservoir pressure is, so it knows what reference compressibility and reference viscosity it needs to have. So we still need that average reservoir pressure. In a numerical model, you do not need to do this. When you're trying to estimate your average reservoir pressure to get these, the compressibility, viscosity, all that craziness under control, it can work quite well if you're in true boundary dominated flow. But once again, in the systems that we analyze a lot here in North America, when your permeability gets lower, if you have overpressured reservoirs, if your fractures are really close together, it can be very difficult to understand what your contacted volume is and what that average reservoir pressure should be, because the transients last for so much longer. And so what you'll see when you're forecasting a well with rate transient analysis, we call it a pseudo-time issue. If you're forecasting a well and you get a certain volume, and then you increase the volume of your model, you make it a bigger model, and you forecast it, and your forecast has a smaller EUR, a smaller total EUR at the end of it, that's an indication that there's a pseudo-time issue. What I am telling you is, if you have the choice between an analytical model, which is single phase, and a numerical model, go numerical, even for single phase gas. Pseudo-time is one of these things that can modify your results, and not in a very good way. But for many years, analytical model, single phase modeling is what we had. So pseudo-time was required to make it all work. Okay, we are almost through. I think we have this section that I talk about numerical models, and then we're done. I do know that this is an awful lot of information to absorb all in one go. I do want to say to you once again that reservoir signal, if you have a very good understanding of what is meant by reservoir signal when people are talking about it to you, that is very important to me that you know that. I want you to know that the pseudo-steady state inflow equation is the equation for RTA because it gets that average reservoir pressure out. And I also want you to know that RTA has gained popularity because unlike declines, it lets us get that EUR from a physics-based perspective and from a model-based perspective instead of just kind of drawing lines. And it helps us get a sense of our total volume, what we've contacted, how big our reservoir is without having to shut in our well. Those are the big major points that we've kind of tackled so far. So with that said, let's talk about rate transient analysis a little bit deeper. Here's that reservoir signal slide again. You can tell it's important when I put it in more than once, right? This is just something that I like talking about. Clarity on the simple things is so important. And I assume many people are like me. I would not feel comfortable standing in a room full of people years ago saying, can you explain exactly what you mean by reservoir signal, because no one wants to be embarrassed. So if I've clarified that for anybody, that's great because you're exactly where I was. Okay, this is very important. I know at the top of the screen it says unconventional workflow. At this level, at this granularity of this workflow, this is the workflow for any RTA well you will ever analyze on planet Earth. Okay, there's 4 components to analyzing a well. The tools that you might use specifically does matter if it's an unconventional well or a conventional well or things like that. If it's oil, gas, things like that. But the basic workflow, the basic going from A to B to C should always be the same. The first step for any well you would ever analyze in rate transient analysis is data diagnostics. And this is where you're going to look at your data and you're going to try to understand whether you trust it or not. And most likely there's going to be parts that you trust and parts that you think look really weird, or there's something going on, or there's data missing, or sometimes there's flat lines in the data sets. That's a huge red flag that something's been invented or is fake. So what you're doing is you're looking at that raw data and you're doing some sort of quality control. What do I trust? What don't I trust? If I'm missing something, can I find it somewhere else and add it to the data set? You want to have as cohesive a data set that's believable as possible before you move on. This step is not difficult to do, but it is the one that I see most people not spend the time on. And the reason it's important is because if you take bad data that is not trustworthy, data that should be thrown out or just not looked at or analyzed, and you take those data points which just are meaningless and you start applying different things to it, such as that superposition I mentioned a moment ago, you can start to take garbage data and make it look great. And so that's where really bad decisions get made. If you take terrible data and you put it through and it's superposition and it comes out looking like something that's meaningful, this is how people make very expensive mistakes. Spending time looking at the quality of your data before you move forward has to be done every time. People don't do it because they want to save themselves a little bit of time, but I've seen a few cases in particular where it's cost them a whole lot of money. So data diagnostics, you're going to do that no matter what well it is. You're going to look at the data, you're going to look at the raw data, you're going to look at the ratios, you're going to get a sense if there's any gaps, you're going to look at the pressures. You just want to get a sense if everything looks sensical, if there's a natural, nice flow to the information. Once you've done that, the next step is always going to be interpretation. Interpretation means that you're going to look at that data and you're going to use different tools, such as that Fetkovich type curve I told you about before, such as the flowing material balance, which we went through the equation for to get a sense of your contacted volume. You're going to listen to what that data is trying to tell you. On that slide of reservoir signal, you recall I told you the curvature of that line has that information. It has the information about the reservoir and the completion within it. Interpretation is where we decode that reservoir signal. We're going to capture and describe the shape of it through things like fracture half-lengths if it's a fractured well, through permeability, through skin, through contacted volume. All of that we're trying to decode from that reservoir signal. And the reason we're doing that is if we can describe that reservoir signal properly, we can recreate it. And this is where the next step comes in, which is modeling. Modeling, the primary purpose for a model is to validate your interpretation, to take the reservoir signal that you've captured and try to rebuild your pressure and rate history. For those of you that have never used a reservoir model before, typically what they do is they will take a rate or a pressure. So let's just start with rate. It will take a rate. It has the PVT information, the initial pressure, the values that you've interpreted for volume and things like that. And it will take a rate, goes through the equations, and it calculates a bottom hole pressure. And it will do this through the history of your well. And what you're trying to do is to line up the synthetic or calculated pressures and have them match the pressures that you measured at the wellbore. If you have your rates and they agree with each other and your pressures when they agree with each other, that's when you go to the last bucket here, which is forecasting. This is where you can create a physics-based forecast to get your EUR, to get your reserves. Remember, this forecast is based on a physics-based model based on values that we got from listening to the data, and it's creating a forecast that isn't just drawing a line through data, but is dynamically calculating the equations to go through and come up with that future curve. And that's how you get your reserves. This is how you can start to do things such as, we could refer to them as optimization scenarios, where you could start to say, what if we refractured this well? What if we had produced it at a lower drawdown? All of these different things can be played with once you're in the forecasting. Notice that between interpretation and modeling, I have these two arrows up here. Very typically, after you've interpreted a well, you will go to a model, and the model won't necessarily match as well as you would like. And you'll notice that something appears inconsistent, which you will then go back to your interpretation, and you're going to try to look at it a little bit more tightly. And then you'll go and take those values back to the model. And as you go back and forth, you're going to converge on a smaller range of possible solutions. No one knows what the answer is. There's a range of solutions, and your goal is to make that range of solutions as small as possible. So this is the workflow. Any well I analyze, I go through this basic workflow each and every time. This is another visualization of the interpretation and the modeling. On the left-hand side, I have my rates and my pressures. If anyone's seen raw data before, it is pretty messy. It can be anyway, and it can bounce up and down all over the place. Interpretation is how we're going to look at that kind of craziness in the data and extract out that reservoir signal, right? So that's interpretation. That's why it's so important. And that's why if you go to the IHS booth whenever the conferences start again, you'll notice we'll be talking about models a lot, because models are fun to watch. They change colors. There's a lot going on there. But interpretation is really the challenging portion. Interpretation is where we as engineers need to really sit there, think about what we're doing, uses our experience, uses our insight, and it's the tough part. That's why a lot of people don't talk about it as much as modeling. But once through interpretation, we have that reservoir signal, we can then take that and we can rebuild our rate history. So I could take this rate and calculate what the pressure should be. I could then take this rate, put it in my equations, calculate what my pressure should be. And I should be able to recreate that rate and pressure history. And that gives me a lot of confidence that I understand what's going on in my reservoir. So what is a reservoir model? I've touched on it a few times. Here's an illustration of that. It's a tool that uses input parameters. So these are the parameters here. I'm sure they're too small to see, but there's things there such as my initial pressure, my fracture half length. This is for an unconventional well, of course. Permeability, porosity, saturations, those volumetric inputs, net pay height, so important. And so what we're going to do is take those values, and we're going to calculate a synthetic value. So here's my pressure, This is my real pressure. This is the pressure that I brought into the software. These are my real oil rates. These are my real gas rates. And these are my real water rates. So what I'm trying to do in this case is I'm trying to recreate the history. So in this case, I'm using pressure. And for every pressure that I have, the model is calculating a oil rate, a gas rate, and a water rate. And here an oil rate, a gas rate, and a water rate. And notice how my water, my synthetic water, doesn't quite match my real water till later in time. That's very common when we have a lot of flow back after a big completion job, right? Because what we're trying to model is the water that was in the reservoir originally. So this blue line is my average reservoir pressure. And we're trying to recreate the rates and pressures through history, because then we can look into the future with that higher degree of confidence. So for those of you that haven't seen the model before, that's an example of what one looks like. I did touch on this as well, the difference between analytical and numerical models. Analytical means single phase. For gas, you would need to use Pseudo-Time in order to do those calculations. Numerical models, some people refer to them as multi-phase models, but you can do it just for dry gas as well. It doesn't require that Pseudo-Time Pseudo-Time calculation. So it's going to give you a better forecast or a more reliable forecast if you were susceptible to Pseudo-Time issues. So as you are trying to get your analysis and get people to believe your analysis, or for you to believe your analysis, you have to kind of go in your dome of increasing confidence. It starts with that data diagnostics, choosing the right data. A lot of the interpretive tools we have are single phase, some are multi-phase, but you want to interpret that data. Then some folks like to stay with analytical models, but if you really want to get to that increased confidence, you really want to get to those numerical or multi-phase models, depending how you want to refer to them. This is the last couple of slides that I have for the presentation. I threw this in here. I wasn't sure if folks who are attending, some might have more of a background on modeling and some might not. I try to have information that I think is valuable for everybody. So while this is overall an introduction, I thought if I had time, I would discuss very quickly when trying to match a model, some tips on getting those model matches faster. So if you are someone who's doing some reservoir modeling or have done it before, trying to get those models to match, I hope what I have to offer you here saves you a little bit of time in the future. Okay. So this is the numerical model. Once again, this is, I use just an oil well. There's oil, gas, and pressure. Usually when you're modeling, you need to have a frame of reference, okay? So either you can choose to be the pressure, and then the model is going to calculate the oil, the gas, and the water, or you can choose to be oil, and then it will calculate the pressure, the water, and the gas, or you can choose to be gas, or for whatever reason, if you really wanted to, you could choose to be water. But whenever you're making a model, you have to have a frame of reference. Very typically, people will choose the frame of reference, the context of their primary fluid. So if this was an oil well, I would say that I'm oil, and I want to calculate the gas, I want to calculate the pressure. If this was a gas condensate well, I'd want to pretend that I was gas, and that I could then calculate my condensate and then my pressure. If you are trying to get a match between fluids, so notice how my match here looks great from beginning to end. If my gas and my oil were mismatching, that tells me that I need to go and look at my PVT information, my bubble point, for example, or I need to look at my rel perm curve, something like that. Because what I'm trying to do there is to make the relationship between the parent and the child, not really in terms of wells, but remember, I think of the gas as a child, to get them to get along. So if your fluids are mismatching, that's a PVT or a rel perm issue. If you're looking for a pressure match, that is when you would change the parameters in the model itself that I showed you a screenshot of a moment ago. So if you're trying to match a model, the best way to think about it is, especially for getting a pressure match, is in terms of drawdown. So this blue line is my simulated average reservoir pressure. This is my simulated wellbore flowing pressure. What I want you to know is that that drawdown is going to give you an indication of whether you should increase the productivity of your well or decrease it, right? So if you need to increase it, here you'll see that my pressure match is too high. My real data is here, my simulated pressure is here. My drawdown is not big enough. I need to increase my drawdown. you increase your drawdown by making the productivity of your well worse, right? So that would be to make your skin worse, to lower the permeability of your well, for example. That's going to increase that gap between the two for you to get a match. So as you're going through using models to get a match, the software will try to solve it for you if you so choose, but you can go through sensibly just thinking about it in terms of drawdown and volume to try to get a match. And so I do it manually just because I actually find it easier than using the automated tools in Harmony. Conversely, here you can see my pressure match is too low. This would tell me that I need to increase the productivity of my well. I need to increase, if I had a fracture half length, I need to increase my permeability. I need to make a skin better. And what it's going to do is to bring that data right back up. So when you're trying to get a match, if you're matching pressure, think of it in terms of productivity of your well, and that's going to help you get a sense of what you should change in order to get a match sooner. And that is all I prepared for today's talk. Unconventional systems, we could talk for another 8 hours about that, I'm sure. But this was a fundamental overview of the primary points of rate transient analysis, how it interacts with pressure transient analysis and decline analysis, how we don't need that average reservoir pressure in order to get a sense of our fluids in place, how we can take data that clients and companies are already recording and getting value out of that without them needing to shut in the wells, how you can use that data to understand your systems and your completions to make better decisions moving forward, or to identify wells where if you just invested a little bit more money, you could make them more productive and make more money from them as well. Every well you analyze with RTA, if you want to do it a quality job from beginning to end, you want to do data diagnostics where you're looking at the quality of your data, the interpretation where you're going to listen to that reservoir signal, a model to verify your interpretation to make sure that reservoir signal that you captured is consistent. And then if you want a forecast to get a sense of what your physics-based EUR is going to be. So that's all I prepared. I thank you very much for your attention during all of that. That is a lot of information in a very short amount of time.
Thank you so much for this insightful and informative session. We are very grateful you took time out of your busy schedule to address our group. Now I would like to proceed with the questions of our audience, if you don't mind.
Of course.
Okay. Just a second. I need to open the question. Yeah. The first question is, how long is the short time period to keep a PWF constant?
That's a great question. And different people would have different answers. So this is one of those things where I always know I'm being recorded because I don't want to be overly quoted on that. It depends on the frequency of your data. I would say that I'm sure it can be very short if you have high resolution data. Typically for us, we want a few days from an RTA perspective. When you're interpreting the data, you want at least a few days to kind of get a sense of the reservoir signal, but to hold it, to get reservoir signal to present itself, as long as everything's stabilized, that's what you would need. And so it would depend on what well, what system, what reservoir you have. I don't know the exact time, but it would be quite short if you had the tools to sense it. Is that okay?
Thank you for answering. Yeah,
okay.
Thank you for answering. Another question is rate transient analysis applicable to gas condensate system as well? Is it reliable?
So the answer is yes. It is applicable to gas condensates. In fact, in the Permian, which is very popular right now, that's what we're using to analyze those wells. But is it reliable? Let me get down to that. Rate transient analysis is very similar to any other type of analysis you're going to do. The confidence in your results will be distinctly based on the how much confidence you have of the values going into it. Initial pressure, I believe, is the most important value that someone needs in order to put into their software in order to do rate transient analysis. And it's also the value that I don't believe a lot of people spend a lot of money or time figuring out. So your confidence in how well your analysis is going to be depends directly in your confidence of the PVT information and the reservoir properties that you've put into the software.
Thank you so much. The next question is, in the equations for PSS, did you account for skin as well, or does it need to be added?
Yeah, so skin is something that would be added afterwards. Now, BPSS is a way that we take into account a productivity loss. When we think of it in terms of the generation of that equation for unconventional wells, we think of it in terms of dimensionless fracture conductivity, but it's a productivity loss. You could call it a skin. BPSS is the term that would encapsulate that. And if you look at it in a more expanded way, you would see the skin factor there. If anyone does analyze wells with linear flow, you would see something of a positive y-intercept, which would indicate a skin factor or a productivity loss.
Thanks a lot. Another question is, what's the minimum limit of production data, years of production, we should have it so we can use RTA or decline curve analysis?
So that's an excellent question. So for rate transient analysis, I am very hesitant to analyze anything that has less than 6 months of data. Very commonly, I'm asked by clients to analyze 3 months of data, and I will do it. But it's very much to the previous question as well as how much confidence would I have. The less data I have, the more possible forecasts I can create. The more data I get, the tighter those forecasts are going to be. For decline analysis, I would really. Once again, it depends on the reservoir. It depends on the signal that you're getting. But if it's a conventional system, if you're getting a signal that really appears to give you a sense of bounded flow, I would say that would be enough. But I start to feel more comfortable after about a year or so. But other folks who focus more on declines would probably disagree with me on that. On RTA, I like to see at least 6 months worth of data.
Thank you very much. And the final question is, could you please explain the concept of boundary dominated flow?
Absolutely. Okay, so there's there's different flow regimes that we have. There's different lives that our wells are going to have, depending on the systems the system that it's in. In a conventional well, what's going to happen is when your well starts to produce, it's almost like your well becomes alive. Okay, so your well, it's conscious, and basically what it's doing, it's producing, and all it knows is the pressure pulse that it's creating just keeps going out, 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 out. And that's what we're going to call transient flow. So the pressure's unbounded, it's going out, and it doesn't know what's going on, and it goes and it goes and it goes. Eventually, what's going to happen is that pressure pulse is going to hit boundaries on all sides. Now, whether that's because there's another well producing next to it, so there's a no flow pressure boundary, or it's a geological boundary, eventually you're going to hit boundaries. And once you've hit boundaries all the way through, how the flow acts changes, and we call it boundary dominated flow. Other people call it tank type behavior, but that means that you've hit this bounded flow, and the rates and the pressures are very predictable at that point. You have a tank, and it's just emptying out until the energy in the fluid can't lift any more out. So that's boundary dominated flow. You're bounded on all sides. Your delta P in what you're producing, the material balance, it's going to persist until the well is dead.
Thank you very much for answering our question with a special attention. We hope we shall see you in our next sessions as well. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you for your time. I appreciate it.
And also, please do not forget to finish and submit the quiz before deadline. Moreover, you can watch this webinar again from PioPetro's YouTube channel. Stay safe, everyone.